I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2014 SU Research Day and Innovation Showcase. I'm Clifton Griffin, Dean of Grad Studies and Research. First and foremost, thank all of you for being here. In particular, I'd like to thank our Provost, Dr. Allen, sitting back here for her support for this event and for research and scholarship overall. This day is about creating connections. Those connections are important, whether it's faculty member to faculty member right here on campus, or it's creating connections between our campus and the outside community. That's what we hope will be the takeaway message from your presentations today. As you can tell from the program, we have a wide array of topics. It's going to be fascinating. I can't wait. I've already had a little bit of a snippet of almost all of the presentations, and I can tell you, you will be wowed. Also awesome to see some of last year's presenters who are here supporting folks from this year. We certainly appreciate their participation and their being here. Up with a perplexing question that I struggle with daily is Dr. Jennifer Cox. To tweet or to post? That is the question.
Thank you. This is very Shakespearean, right? And Twitter and Facebook are pretty much anything but Shakespearean. But as I was preparing for this talk, I thought I would do what I always do and procrastinate on Facebook for a while. You know, that's part of human nature now. And so when I was doing that, I came across this fun little clip actually just this week on Facebook. So I just want to share a quick second of it. Super fun, right? We all know those guys. Okay. And so I was kind of playing around and just wasting time, as you do on Facebook. And I looked at the source, which normally I don't look at until after I've already viewed the video. And I was thinking, okay, it's probably something silly like Zimbio or Slade or something like that, something that is one of those click generators. They exist solely to just get clicks and get people to click on their website. And come to find out, it was actually the USA Today site that this was coming from. So as a journalist, I was a little taken aback by that and thought, that's different. But actually, it's very key in news strategy right now. Now it's not just all about getting the news out there. Now we have to actually worry about maintaining an audience, and social media is to blame for that. So what we're starting to see is a real shift in news definitions. We're starting to see news organizations departing from some of their tried and true news stories, informing the public, and starting to kind of get out there and think about social media in their news decisions. And by the way, the USA Today also happens to own our local paper, the Daily Times. So you might see a little bit of trickle down there with this. But it's something that news organizations are starting to incorporate in their strategy. How can we make this popular? How can we make this big on social media? So to share with you a few examples, these are the stories that were trending yesterday on as far as the most shared news stories on Huffington Post. These are the top 4. This dog's final day proves we should live every day like it's our last. Mother accused of molesting 3 of her kids while adults watched. Look, annoying airplane passenger got exactly what she deserved. And 11 reasons to love Costco that have nothing to do with shopping. It's informative stuff, right? So that's Huffington Post. Let's look at CNN yesterday. These were the top shared stories on CNN in order, 1, 2, 3. Verizon drops plan to throttle data hogs. Coke and Pepsi launch competing green stevia cans. And America's top 20 speeding ticket magnets. Good stuff, right? Now you might think, okay, well that's Huffington Post and that's CNN, and they tend to veer toward infotainment anyway, right? So we can kind of write that off a little bit. However, nobody is immune to infotainment, to this social media bombardment. All right, so this is the New York Times, and this article is a really special one. And you may or may not have ever heard of it, but it's called What Shamu Taught Me About a Happy Marriage. And essentially what it is, it's no more than just a simple marriage advice column in which the author relates training her husband in the same techniques that she learned by training dolphins at SeaWorld. Who couldn't, right? And so, we would think, okay, no big deal. It's pretty typical kind of advice column, no big thing. But the fact that she mentioned Shamu and aquatic animals, which are always popular with audiences, and marriage advice, something that's helpful to audiences that readers can relate to, sent this in 2006 skyrocketing to the most emailed New York Times story of all time in 2006. And it still sits high atop that list today. And so what does this mean for us? Well, there's a lot of different ways that we can take this into consideration. The first, obviously, is that news organizations are starting to recognize that Twitter and Facebook are important for driving people to their websites. They're starting to realize that what people have traditionally told us they want in news, public affairs topics like education and health and the environment and governance, stuff that matters, right? That's what they told us that they wanted when we would survey them. But now we can see, using social media and advanced media metrics, what they're actually looking at. And what they're actually looking at is Shamu stories, salacious stuff, gossip, weird crime, oddity, that kind of thing. So they're looking at the really fun and funky stuff. And so now what do news organizations do with that information? Now that we know it, you can't lie to us anymore. We know what you're looking at, all of you. All right, what do we do with that? It's disheartening as a journalist, for sure, to say, well, why isn't anyone reading my government story that I sat in planning and zoning for 5 hours to cover? That's the most exciting thing ever, right? So we have to think as journalists, how can we balance this out? Where can we go with this? Now, I want to take a minute to recognize and establish that Twitter and Facebook are completely different. They have very different uses, very different users. So I want to break down some of those differences for you here for a minute. First of all, Twitter tends to skew much younger. All right, most of our students are on Twitter. They're not necessarily as active on Facebook. They might have a Facebook account. They're not on Facebook. And the reason why, by the way, is because they think that their parents aren't on Twitter, but their parents are on Facebook. And I tell them all the time, your parents are totally on Twitter. They're just following you under a fake name. But anyway, they think their parents aren't on Twitter. And so Twitter tends to skew about age 35 and under. Whereas Facebook is becoming more popular with an older segment of audience, and it actually runs the gamut. Now, people of all ages have Facebook accounts, but we're starting to see growth above the age of 44 exponentially. And so we're seeing a lot of older people become more comfortable with that type of social media technology. So first of all, we have different users. Different Twitter and Facebook features are part of the equation as well. Now on Twitter, for those of you guys who don't know how Twitter works, Twitter actually limits you to 140 text characters. So it's not very visual, it's very short, quick to the point. It's actually very well suited for journalists who just have to get to the point. And it's very searchable. So users will use hashtags and search keywords and terms and things like that to try and get people to find them when they're not necessarily following them. So you can actually search for an issue rather than a person or an organization. Whereas Facebook is going to be much more visual and much more interactive. The type of audiences that we have for Twitter and Facebook are different too. On Twitter, if our profile is set to public, and most of them are, anybody can follow us and we can follow anybody. So it's much more of an open forum. So you're going to see a lot more of following people who you don't necessarily know, you may not have ever met. Whereas on Facebook, you actually have to establish a relationship. Somebody has to agree to be friends with you, and you with them, in order for you to see their information and for them to see yours. So it's a very different kind of interaction there. And then finally, different uses for it. Now, Twitter is one of those that scrolls constantly. If you have a Twitter account, you'll notice that it's updating every single second. And it's just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and there's so much news. It's all about breaking news, what's happening right now. Nobody cares what happened 5 minutes ago. It's right now on Twitter. Whereas on Facebook, you know, when you have 20 minutes to kill, you can scroll through an entire day's worth of missed posts, and you'll be fine. You can actually get caught up and look and see, and you could feasibly read everything that all of your friends post on Facebook within probably an hour. Whereas on Twitter, there's no way. There's no way you're going to get caught up on Twitter. Just move on. All right? And news organizations are not blind to these differences. And so what I looked at with my study that I did last year was I looked at how these different news organizations were using Twitter and Facebook. Twacebook? That's a good one. I think I just invented something. Twitter and Facebook. How do we use these differently? And so what I did was I pulled 6 news organizations, and I pulled all of their social media tweets over the course of 6 weeks for a day each week. And so what I came up with was a whole lot of social media. All right, and the way that they were using these sites was very different. First of all, and I promise these are the only graphs I have in here. This is it, I promise. So you'll see here that most of these news organizations were using Twitter substantially more than Facebook. As a matter of fact, it was about a 4-to-1 ratio, which is what we expected. There just is a lot more content on Twitter, and news organizations are not dumb to that. Now, you might see an exception here, CNN, and that's because if you remember I mentioned before, Facebook is a much more visual medium, and so they have access, obviously, and produce a lot of video, so it would be a more natural home for them. I'm not sure why MSNBC doesn't embrace that same strategy, but who knows. So you might also notice, if you are a math major, that there's only 5 sites here, and I said I looked at 6. That's because Huffington Post posted so much throughout a given week that they would have completely skewed this scale, and you wouldn't have been able to see any of this. 2008 Twitter posts in 1 week compared to 386 Facebook posts. They are on there a lot. And I'll tell you, after I finished this study, I had to stop following Huffington Post on Twitter because it was just blowing up my account. Couldn't do it anymore. So what did I find? Aside from just Twitter versus Facebook, the sheer number and volume of posts, there was a distinct difference in the type of topics that we were seeing. So on Twitter, we were seeing a lot more political and breaking news topics. So things like this: man charged in shooting of Howard County officer, healthcare site needs dozens of fixes, RNC pushes another rebrand ahead of elections. All right, pretty standard, simple stuff, getting the message out there quick and in real time. It's all breaking news, it's all happening right now. On Facebook, things got a little lighter, a little more lifestyle, and a little more what we like to call evergreen in journalism. And what that means is that basically this story could run anytime. It doesn't have a specific time peg. It can run today or tomorrow or next year or whenever. So it's an evergreen. So we have Eat Your Way to 100, Awesome Woman Goes from Nanny to Co-Founder of Major Company, and my personal favorite, Stop Everything Because Pandas. Why wouldn't you, right? So where does that put us? What does this even mean? Most of you guys probably aren't journalists and really don't care what kind of decisions that journalists have to make on a daily basis. But we know from research, and you've probably read before, that what we put out there, what people consume as news matters. It affects their behavior. It affects the way that they live their lives. There's a popular theory in communication, and I won't bore you with too many of the specifics of it, but it basically indicates that the more crime news that you take in, the more fearful you are of the place that you live. And so that tells us that there are real-world sociological impacts to the things that people are consuming as news. So where do we go from there? Well, this is a quantitative study. So we can't really speculate too much on the why, but luckily there's a lot of good theory that points us in the right direction. And that's hopefully the direction that I'll be going in next. There's some bad news here. If we're only consuming news on Facebook that's light and fun and funny and silly and helpful and self-involved, that might make us more self-involved. That might actually encourage us to just think about ourselves, to kind of stop thinking about how to better the world, only start thinking about how to improve ourselves. And it might also make us a little bit more ignorant, because as you saw here, we're consuming far less news on Facebook than on Twitter, and the kind of news that we're getting is not the public affairs stuff that's really going to help us move in our lives. On Twitter, the bad news is that you might become a lot more polarized. There's so much political news on Twitter. The ratio is about 3-to-1 as far as Facebook posts and Twitter posts on Twitter or on political news. Now, what that means is that you might be getting a lot more polarized. We might be creating a more polarized society where people are starting to get madder, more charged up about their political preferences. And also, people might start becoming more desensitized to the kind of crime and breaking news items that plague our community. So that might be happening, but there's possible good news too. I always leave on the good news. I don't end with the bad news. The good news is that on Facebook, there's actually been a lot of research that tells us that more people click on the link and actually go to the news website from Facebook than they do on Twitter. So our Facebook users are actually clicking on the links and going to the Washington Post, going to USA Today, going to those news websites, and hopefully, fingers crossed, they're staying and getting some of the news that we think they need. All right, so that's a possibility. There's also a possibility that these people are actually improving themselves and actually going forth and living their lives in a constructive manner and starting to broaden their horizons and think outside of their own bubble. On Twitter, the good news is actually that psychological research has shown that Twitter has actually helped increase knowledge of political issues and reduced polarization in some ways. So a lot of times we can actually start to understand the other side's perspective and engage in a more useful political discourse. Also, there's greater exposure to news on Twitter. Now, I tell my students this all the time. We give them a hard time because, you're kids and you're ignorant and you don't read the newspaper, blah, blah, blah. They are more exposed to news than any generation prior to now. And it's no secret, I will not even kid you, students in their 18 to 22 range have never read newspapers. Never. It's not something that's a new phenomenon. In the 50s, people weren't reading newspapers when they were 18, okay? And so this generation, whether they like it or not, are more exposed to news than they ever have been before. And so that's an exciting thing. Exposure doesn't always mean that it's absorbing, but we can hope, right? Maybe if we throw some spaghetti at the wall, something will stick. Okay? And so this really gives us an opportunity to look forward and see where the realm of social media is going to take us with journalism. As journalists, we have to try and find some sort of a balance here. I'm not here to say that, the New York Times is going to start publishing Kardashian news every day now, but we have to try and figure out where the balance is going to be. Are we going to be publishing things that people want, or are we going to be publishing things that people need? And traditionally, as journalists, we had the luxury of saying, we don't really care what you want. We're going to tell you what we think you need. But now that the industry is kind of in a nosedive, in a bit of a tailspin, we do have to start paying attention to what our readers want. And that may not be such a bad thing. We just have to try and strike a good balance. So where do we go from here? Well, to tell you the truth, I don't know. We're still figuring it out. We saw this all really start to generate in 2006, back with that New York Times story that I was telling you about. Things kind of started ramping up at that point. We were trying to figure out, okay, we have this knowledge now, what do we do with it? And the answer to that question is, we don't know. We're still trying to figure it out every single day. At the Daily Times, they recently just instituted a policy where in their budget lines, which is basically just a short blurb about what the reporters are writing that day, they actually have to include, we think this will drive social media because X, Y, and Z. So that's a very new development as of last week. Okay? So we are pushing forward with this. We're trying to figure out the strategy. We're trying to figure this out in a way that's intellectual and enjoyable for our readers. And I say readers, but I mean readers, viewers, listeners, any form of media. And so where we go from here is really unknown. But what we do know is that this is going to change society forever. Thank you. Any questions? Please.
So if I wanted someone to read my research, I should title it Shamu, Pandas, and Kardashians Torturing 17th Century Chesapeake.
Add some sex and murder in there, and you got yourself a book. Bestseller.
But I was just joking, but are journals doing that? Are they changing titles?
Yes.
So like you could put like Kardashians, I don't know, whatever, and then the articles about them.
Here's the funny thing about that. That article that I showed you, Shamu is not mentioned once in that article. It actually has nothing to do with it. They absolutely did that on purpose. And there's actually a name for it. It's called, and I see some of my students here. Anyone know what that's called? Felicia's hiding. Search engine optimization, SEO, is what we call it. And it was invented right about that time. And what that means is that we're going to put in weird keywords or keywords that are going to stand out so that when you go into Google, which is what you're doing now, you're not going to WashingtonPost.com, you're going to Google when you want to find something. You're putting in words like Shamu and marriage and things like that. That's what's going to pop up. And so yes, it is a very conscious effort on journalists' part. Is it a little sleazy? Yeah, we need to shower a little more. But, at the end of the day, if people are reading our story, do the ends justify the means? Sometimes. Not always, but sometimes.
We all have to have some communication. We need to listen to this because as science communicators or history communicators, this is a big deal. National Science Foundation has a Facebook, their Twitter. So I guess the question then comes, what is the role that we have? We've seen bad behavior on Facebook within institutions and students want to friend us. So what's the issue, right? So what do you think is the best use of this new technology and the trends in being having a good use of social media and getting out the word on what we all do, because we need to be better communicators.
Do you have a few days? Yeah. No, I mean, the short answer of that is that we just, it's a silly answer, but it's honestly the one that makes most sense. We just have to have some common sense. We need to approach Facebook and Twitter, social media in general, like we are readers, like we consume it. So when we go out, we can't be elitist in what we think people are going to read. We have to pay attention to what we actually read and think about how we can parlay that into something that's going to be useful for whoever our audience is. And so, I know you do work in biology, and so, super stilted terms, and there's a lot of them, jargon, things like that, that kind of thing might not attract general audiences. And so what you might want to think about doing is using more user-friendly language, some of the things that are going to start to appeal to the people that you want to reach. And if that's, grant managers who understand that stuff, great. But if it's not, if you're just trying to generate some public interest in your research, you might think about trying to say it in a way that you would want to read it if you weren't the principal. If that makes any sense. And we can talk lots more about that, Kim.
My question kind of relates to the profession of journalism, and I guess the alarm that those of us who are sort of consumers of traditional newspapers have when we see that the older journalists are being fired in favor of people who can be hired more cheaply as younger journalists, and then also the closing of bureaus overseas and even across the country, where the most prestigious papers had bureaus everywhere. But is there any cause for optimism when you think about the profession of journalism and adjusting to these new realities and getting good information out there?
Absolutely. And I tell my students this all the time. Yeah, there's a lot of doom and gloom in this industry right now. It's a fact. But I tell my students, those of you who are excited about journalism and want to get into journalism could not have picked a better time, because our young people have a greater advantage than any generation previous going to the newsroom. And I tell them all the time, I walked into the newsroom, how old am I now? About 12 years ago. And I handed out papers, I got ink all over my clothes, I answered phones, I stuffed mailboxes, and occasionally somebody would throw me a freelance story to go cover the Girl Scouts event. That's how I started in journalism, all right? But our students that we send into local newspapers now, editors are clamoring for them to say, what do we do? What do we do with Instagram? What do we do with Twitter? How do we get our messages out? How do we reach your generation? Never have young people had that kind of power before. And the exciting thing, it's bad for the old timers who don't really want to change, who don't really want that interaction. But the bottom line, and that's happened a lot in newsrooms too, where you've got somebody who's a little set in his or her ways, who really isn't ready to embrace this change. And unfortunately, as the market shows us, innovators, those who fail to innovate, get pushed out. And so we have young people coming in with fresh ideas about news and fresh ideas about how to reach people. And it's really breaking the journalism formula, which I find a little exciting. They say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, it's broke. So these young people have the answers, I think. And it's exciting that we can turn to them, these new people with new ideas and new skills, teach them the old ways, and then ask them what they're going to do with them. That's the hope, anyway.
This is probably the most obvious question, but
Yes.
saying that I don't know anything about this field. But what I worry about is all this personalization of news feeds. So through Twitter or whatever you're collecting your news on, you get to pick what you're interested in. And yet, to be a really engaged citizen, you need to see that story that you didn't even think of Albania. Why is that? And engage with that when I might not otherwise think about Albania or to the point Syria or Ukraine. And so you're kind of forced, if you're reading a traditional format, you're forced to see that on the front page. You're forced to see the jump on the front page. And when you personalize your news, the receipt of news, you can kind of, I really wonder about how I can get my nails to grow or whatever, and not.
How do you do that?
So I mean, how do journalists address that? Because people need to know, that old thing about, you need to know what you don't know, basically.
Yeah. And that's exactly where we're at. I mean, that customization of news is one of the worst and best things to ever happen to media. Because as consumers, we get to pick and choose. But again, we are limiting ourselves. And how can we possibly make democratic decisions in a society where we're limiting ourselves to one perspective, one point of view? And I think Twitter has a better chance of solving that problem than Facebook does, because you are being exposed to more news whether you like it or not by following a news organization. Now, that being said, how do we get them there? Well, as a journalist in the newsroom, we try to think of ways to approach a story that would appeal to our readers. So if you're going to cover a city council meeting, don't just write a story saying the city council approved an ordinance 3-2 to do blah, blah, blah. We have to learn how to address our audiences. You know, your taxes will go up because of this thing. And we should be doing that anyway. So in a way, this is kind of a positive slap in the face for journalists who aren't thinking about their readers. Now, that being said, I mean, there's a lot of problems with customization. You hit on a lot of them, and it is one of the major downsides here of social media. But I think we really do have a good opportunity, and that's what a lot of our young students will be able to help us to do too.
Great. Jennifer, thank you very much.